My name is Jesse Knight. I am one of the programmers for Palm Springs ShortFest. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Topic for sharing this film, Call Center Blues, with our audience. I'm very honored and excited to speak with our guest, the director of Call Center Blues. She is an accomplished filmmaker and editor. She's the winner of 2 Emmys. Her latest film, Call Center Blues, has made the shortlist for the Best Documentary Short Oscar. Geeta Gandbhir, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me personally congratulate you on making the short list. I know it's probably bittersweet to celebrate something like this during the pandemic, but what's it been like for you and your team since the announcement?
I think, honestly, this was, I think like a lot of documentaries, this was a sort of a film that truly was a passion project. It was a small crew, a small team, something that came out of, an article I read, about the community of deportees that was sort of growing in Tijuana, this incredibly brave, resilient community. And when we set out to make this film, we didn't know what we would find and with the stories, but we had such an incredibly generous group of participants who were willing to share their stories with us. And the team itself, there was so much great synergy and also just kind of love between us. I think it was an amazing experience to make this film. It was one of those ones where I cannot say I have, with every film you make, I think sometimes there's something that happens where you're like, oh, I wish that had gone differently, or there's some maybe regret you have. This film is one of those really special ones where I really have no regrets and was so grateful for the opportunity to make it. So it's to have it be shortlisted is a huge honor, is a really a huge honor. And also I have to say, I'm so pleased to be in the cohort that I'm in. It's a really impressive group of films, and I'm pleased that that the representation that I see in the filmmakers, sort of the inclusion, the diversity, that makes it feel like a special year, despite COVID, despite everything else that we're struggling through.
Why don't you start us off by talking about what you mentioned, the article that you read, but why was it important for you to tell this story?
Sure. So I think, so I come from, and like many of us, here in the U.S., I come from an immigrant background, and for years, I've always followed sort of the trajectory of the politics around migration, and have been disappointed in the sort of punitive policies that have existed since I think time began, since the birth of the country. Um, and I think that for me, so stories about the issues that come with migration, the question of what is home, where is home, displacement, and also that the sort of search for home have always intrigued me. What does it mean to be from one place yet live in another place, et cetera? There's a lot of there's sort of a lot that comes out of that, and of that lived experience. And I read an article in the Times a couple of years back that talked about the fact that the number of deportees in Tijuana had grown to the point where call centers were springing up essentially to recruit them for their English speaking abilities. So there was sort of this opportunistic capitalism that was happening, and then the deportees themselves were forming their own communities, again, of being, having in common the deportation and the language, and then also the culture of America, being displaced, really what they feel are displaced Americans. Because for many of them, they lived in the US for the majority of their lives. So I think all of those things, fascinated me. The sort of the connection between all of those elements. And I thought that, this is an incredible story. You also don't hear much about what happens to folks who are deported when they reach the other side. You kind of hear about the deportations, and recently in the last 4 years, we've been hearing about the horrors of family separation, which was happening previously as well. But this is a story that it feels like you don't hear as much about. So I was interested in how people were rebuilding their lives and where that story would take us.
Right. And one of the aspects that I love so much about the movie is that the call center is really just a gateway to all these different personal stories. What was your approach in deciding which individual stories to tell and which subjects to follow?
So I had one of the things that was really important to us. I worked with, once I decided that this was a story I was interested in, I pitched it to Topic Stories, and they were really supportive and agreed that it would make an incredible film. And at the time, it felt like a short would do it. We weren't sure where we would land, and a short is always sort of a safer bet when you don't know if the story holds up for an extended period of time, or how much time you could actually get with folks on the ground. So they came on board, and then we partnered. I wanted to partner with Multitude Films because they also have a sort of values-based approach to filmmaking, a very ethical approach. They also are interested in sort of the decolonization of documentary film, and they're an LGBTQ-led company. So these it's just with similar. We have similar values around the way that we want to approach filmmaking. So we partnered, and it was incredibly important to all of us to have representation in our team, meaning local representation. Just to be clear, we none of us, even though I am, from an immigrant background, my DP Asad Farouki is also from an immigrant background, but none of us are from Tijuana. None of us are Mexican. So we thought it was incredibly important to have again folks on the team who are from that community, from Tijuana, and who could hold us accountable, and make sure that we were telling the story, in a way that empowers the storytellers, and make sure we didn't have a colonial lens on it. So we found an amazing producer who was with me in Tijuana the entire time. His name is Abraham Avila, and he was instrumental in gaining the trust of the folks that were in the film. He basically made the connections with all of them, convinced them to speak to us. I mean, it's very challenging for deportees in Tijuana, as you can imagine. They're incredibly vulnerable. They're stigmatized. There's by the local community because they are criminalized in the U.S. That narrative carries over into Tijuana, so they are often seen as as bad people who have done something wrong, and that is why they've been deported. They're seen as criminals. And then they're also incredibly vulnerable because they don't know the culture, they don't know the language, as well as, obviously the people who are local. And oftentimes they can be preyed upon by cartels, there's sort of different factors of society that want to take advantage of them. And for them to out themselves as deportees, again, it lets the world know that what their status is. And I think that of course that can, leave them in a dangerous position. So the team on the ground, again, was instrumental in that. And then our participants were, again, incredibly brave and generous to talk to us at all.
And obviously creating a team of local people who, was helping make it easier to gain their trust, but they're still strangers, right? So you'd still have to take extra steps to make them feel comfortable living in front of the camera.
That's right.
What were some of those steps that you had to take?
Well, I think what's really interesting is we made sure that they understood, it was important to us that they understood that we had a do no harm policy. We spoke about that extensively. There were sort of conversations we had before filming about what we were doing, why we were doing the film, who we were. I think we all were able to sort of bond around our experience as BIPOC people who had lived in the US, at one point, who, and then I think too, there was, again, the idea of what the film was about. I think for most of our participants had already arrived at a place where they wanted to speak out and be active around the issue. One of our participants, Danny, he has founded his own call center and is dedicated to helping other deportees. Because he's just, he had been through it himself and he didn't want to see anyone else suffer. Roberto, also, an incredible advocate and activist, who works with deported veterans. And then Jenna and Alondra, who are two young folks who were themselves not deported, but who were sort of caught in the ripple effects of deportation. Alondra's mother was deported, and as a result, her daughter, Alondra, and her partner Jenna ended up homeless just because there was no one with no parental figure to be able to support them. They ended up on the street, and so they followed Alondra's mother to Mexico in order to seek a better life, which was one of the most ironic things about this film when you think about people, again, normally it was at one time people coming to the US to seek a better life, and the fact that I think our systems are failing our young people so they are leaving, that is something that was a big eye opener for me. But so I think when we, just in sort of building and communicating with these folks and making sure they were clear what the story was about, that it was really a tool to uplift their voices. They're already, of course, empowered. Their voices are present, but again, we just wanted to be a vehicle for that. I think that helped us to gain their trust.
Well, you mentioned the resilience of the community, and there's a moment near the end where someone says about Trump that, like, he says, "God bless him, I hope he regrets, these things that he's doing." And to me, that was so powerful because that's an example, I think, of the resilience that you're talking about, where these people they're not really holding grudges, at least not outwardly. They're hopeful and they're showing compassion for their enemies. Did you notice? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just curious if you noticed that this was common, this hopefulness and this attitude among them.
It's so interesting that you say that. I had a really powerful conversation yesterday with the head of the Center for Constitutional Rights, Vince, and he was saying that essentially that it's something that he said there's a difference between optimism and hope. And he said something really powerful where he said that he thinks that folks who, for a lot of folks, particularly BIPOC folks who have, faced adversity, discrimination, et cetera, marginalization, while living in the US, we're not optimistic, as people of color are not optimistic. Also LGBTQ folks, right? Are not optimistic about anything when it comes to, our lives here in the US, our futures, et cetera, or just, we sort of have maybe a more realistic or perhaps jaded view of things, but that we hold on to hope in a way. It's like a fierce hope because it's about survival in a way that I think, no one else does. And I think that for, I myself have had an incredibly privileged life comparatively, to anyone obviously in this film. But I think that, that sentiment is what comes through for me with these folks in Tijuana. Like, of course there's anger and disappointment and hurt and rage and pain, but there's also this incredible belief that things could change, and things could be better. And that is all you have. That's sort of what there is to go on and how you move forward. So I think that to me was really powerful. And then also there's the comparison, honestly being deported into a country where, again, that nothing about, perhaps, where you're really a foreigner, it's not your home, there is obviously a strong correlation to being put in a penitentiary, right? Like to incarceration. And I think one of the other things that came out of this conversation yesterday from Vince was the idea that that we in the U.S. that folks are often criminalized for seeking their freedom. You know, that it started with slavery when runaway slaves, you know, were immediately criminalized, and the idea that, you know, folks who sort of pursue, um, you know, the pursuit of freedom is, it's again, if it doesn't fit the agenda of the government or you know, the country's agenda at the moment, then you're penalized. And we have these terribly punitive laws that around migration that, you know, even recently you can look at like the Muslim ban, the, you know, the surveillance of entire communities. You can, you know, Muslim communities. You can go back to the incarceration of the Japanese, the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Like the list is endless. And I think, you know, but what folks believe in, for folks to continue to believe that that can change, I think is what is so powerful. And we have to, it's ultimately, a country is about the will of the people, right? And we are the people, it is our country, no matter how much, you know, that has been denied us, and, you know, when is denied us, we have to push forward with that.
Well, thank you, Geeta, for being with us, and best of luck to you and your team on nomination morning.
Thank you.
Call Center Blues is available on Topic, a new streaming service now. For more information, go to topic.com.